1996, America. Imagine this. One day, you mail a company nothing more than a check and claim that the company is now legally obligated to hand you a military fighter jet. It sounds like the plot of a Hollywood movie, but it actually happened. March 28, 1996, Somers, New York. Inside Pepsico's world headquarters, employees were opening the morning mail just like any other day. But among hundreds of ordinary envelopes, one package arrived that would send shockwaves through the entire company. Inside was a cashier's check for $700,000 and $850. The check was made payable directly to Pepsico Incorporated. Attached to it was an official Pepsi Stuff order form. Stapled to the form
were 115 original Pepsi points, and in the prize section, only 4 words had been written. One Harrier jet. At first, the mailroom clerk stared at the form for several seconds. He assumed someone had mailed an elaborate prank, but the moment he looked at the amount on the cashier's check, the smile disappeared from his face. Within minutes, the envelope had been delivered straight to PepsiCo's legal department. Before the workday ended, 3 senior company attorneys were sitting inside a conference room, examining the same check over and over again, because according to PepsiCo's own published rules, a customer might have just legally purchased a Harrier fighter jet, and that customer was John Leonard, just 21 years old, a college business student, not a millionaire, not a pilot, not a military officer. He didn't own an airplane. He had never flown a 40,000-pound U.S. Marine Corps attack aircraft, but he possessed something that PepsiCo's multi-billion-dollar marketing department apparently didn't. The habit of reading every word carefully. John had studied the 64-page Pepsi Stuff catalog not once, not twice, but over and over again, with the same level of attention that a corporate attorney would devote to reviewing a multi-million-dollar contract. And hidden inside those pages, he discovered a single mistake that would drag one of America's largest beverage companies into federal court. Within months, PepsiCo would file a lawsuit against that 21-year-old college student. For nearly 3 years, both sides would battle inside a U.S. federal courtroom. Pepsi would spend almost $2 million on legal fees alone. Meanwhile, John Leonard would fight one of the most unusual legal battles in American history without spending anything beyond what he had already invested. But here's the real question. How could an ordinary college student, armed with nothing more than a promotional catalog and a calculator, force one of the world's largest corporations into federal court? What did he notice that PepsiCo's own executives completely overlooked? To answer that question, we have to rewind 6 months. October 1995, New York City. Pepsi was steadily losing market share
to its biggest rival, Coca-Cola. The company desperately needed a marketing campaign that would reignite excitement across the United States. With that goal in mind, inside a glass-walled conference room on the 30th floor of one of the world's largest advertising agencies, BBDO Worldwide, a new promotional strategy was born. Its name was the Pepsi Stuff Campaign. The concept was brilliantly simple. Customers would collect Pepsi points printed on Pepsi products. Then they could redeem those points for official Pepsi merchandise, t-shirts, leather jackets, sunglasses, mountain bikes, and dozens of other prizes. Nearly $5 million was invested to launch the campaign. More than 2 million copies of a 64-page catalog were distributed to homes across America. But the centerpiece of the entire campaign was a 30-second television commercial. It aired during prime time on NBC, Fox, and nearly
every major television network in the country. The commercial opens at a high school. A teenage student wearing a Pepsi t-shirt walks across campus. Suddenly, an AV-8B Harrier fighter jet descends from the sky and lands right in the middle of the school courtyard. The powerful downdraft blows the principal's hat away. The entire school stares in disbelief. Then, large words appear across the screen. Harrier jet, 7 million Pepsi points. No disclaimer, no fine print, no asterisk, no warning, just bold promise. To Pepsi's marketing team, it was nothing more than a funny commercial, but they had no idea that nearly 3,000 miles away in Seattle, a 21-year-old college student was about to watch that advertisement, not as a joke, but as a legally binding offer. And that moment would ignite a battle that would permanently change the rules of American advertising. Seattle, Washington, October 1995. On the opposite side of America, an ordinary college student was quietly living his life. His name was John Leonard. Born in 1974 in the Pacific Northwest, he wasn't the son of a wealthy family. He wasn't connected to politics, and he wasn't known for any extraordinary achievement. By the fall of 1995, he was just 21 years old. During the day, he studied business administration at the University of Washington. In his spare time, he worked as a part-time outdoor education instructor, leading climbing, hiking, and wilderness programs. His world was remarkably simple, a modest home where he lived with his mother and his stepfather. His parents had divorced when he was still a child. Perhaps that was why he learned very early to see life through logic instead of emotion. While his classmates read novels, John preferred business books. While others memorized stories, he memorized rules. And inside his backpack, alongside his textbooks, there was always a calculator, because he had developed a habit of calculating everything. He had no idea that this simple habit would soon place one of the world's largest corporations under legal scrutiny. One evening, he was sitting at home watching television. Then, during a commercial break, Pepsi's new advertisement appeared. A high school campus, a teenage student, and then, descending from the sky, an AV-8B Harrier fighter jet. To almost everyone watching, it was simply entertainment, a funny commercial, an obvious fantasy. But John Leonard didn't see it the way everyone else did. He paused his VCR. He rewound the commercial. Then he watched it again. Once, twice, 3 times. His attention wasn't on the fighter jet. It was fixed on 6 simple words displayed across the screen. Harrier jet, 7 million Pepsi points. He quietly copied those words onto a small sheet of paper. Perhaps at that very moment, the most important decision of this entire story had already been made. The very next morning, John requested the official Pepsi stuff catalog. A few days later, the 64-page catalog arrived at his home. Most people would have flipped through it for a few minutes and set it aside. But John wasn't reading it for entertainment. He was auditing it once, twice, then a third time. Every sentence, every line, every footnote, as though it wasn't a promotional catalog, but a multi-million-dollar legal contract. Then, during his third reading, his eyes stopped on a single page. A page that perhaps no one inside Pepsi had ever examined with the same level of attention. Page 17. The official rules were printed in tiny type. At first glance, they looked ordinary, but hidden inside those few paragraphs was the future of the entire promotion. John ignored the marketing and focused on the mathematics. The first rule required a minimum of 15 original Pepsi points to redeem any prize. The second rule allowed customers to purchase any additional Pepsi points directly from Pepsico. The price was just 10 cents per point. Then came the third rule, or perhaps the biggest mistake. Nowhere did the catalog state a maximum number of points that a customer could purchase. No limit, no customer cap, no redemption cap. In other words, pay 10 cents and buy as many Pepsi points as you wanted. John picked up his calculator. A Harrier jet required
7 million Pepsi points. 15 points could come from real Pepsi bottles. That left 6,999,985 points at 10 cents each. A few seconds later,
a number appeared on the calculator. $699,998.50. Then another $10 for shipping. Total $700,000.08. John wasn't finished. He ran one more calculation. In 1996, an actual AV-8B Harrier 2 cost approximately $3.38 million, which meant if Pepsi followed its own published rules, the company would have to deliver a military fighter aircraft worth more than $33 million for just $700,000. This wasn't just mathematics. It was a mistake that could cost a multinational corporation millions of dollars. Years later, when John was asked what had been going through his mind at that moment, he answered with a single sentence. It wasn't a get-rich-quick scheme. It was a get-rich-once scheme. Now, the math was on his side. The rules appeared to be on his side too. But one enormous obstacle still remained. $700,000. No 21-year-old college student had that kind of money. Then John remembered someone who possessed not only the financial resources, but also the willingness to bet on an idea that seemed impossible. His name was Todd Hoffman. And from that moment, this story stopped being the story of one determined student. It became the story of an extraordinary partnership.
Coffee had already gone cold, but the decision made at that table was about to change the history of American advertising forever. Todd Hoffman looked at John for a few seconds. Then, without the slightest hesitation, he said, "If your math is right, I'll provide the money." At that moment, an unusual partnership was born. The agreement was simple. Todd Hoffman would invest the entire amount, nearly $700,000. John Leonard would handle everything else. He would complete the official order form, collect the required Pepsi points, and personally mail the entire application to Pepsico. If the company honored its own published rules, the Harrier jet would be theirs. And if Pepsi refused, they would fight together in court. At that point, this was no longer just an idea. It had become a legal strategy. Late March
1996, Todd Hoffman walked into his bank. The paperwork was completed. The signatures were signed. And only minutes later, a bank employee handed him a cashier's check. The amount, $700,008.50, payable to Pepsico Incorporated. Hoffman looked at the check one more time. He knew it wasn't just a piece of paper. It was either about to make history or become the most expensive joke they had ever played. That same afternoon, he met John at the very same Seattle coffee shop. Without giving a dramatic speech, he simply slid the check across the table. Now there was no turning back. March 28, 1996, morning, Seattle, Washington. John Leonard walked toward the post office, holding a thick manila envelope. Inside were 3 items that would soon send PepsiCo's legal department into complete panic. First, a cashier's check for $700,008.50. Second, the official Pepsi stuff order form. Every detail had been
filled out carefully, and in the space marked prize requested, John had written in large, clear letters, 1 Harrier jet. The third item was 15 genuine Pepsi points, cut directly from Pepsi packages and stapled to the order form. John looked through the entire package one last time. Everything followed Pepsi's own rules. No mistakes, nothing missing. He sealed the envelope, addressed it to Pepsi Stuff Redemption, Summers, New York, paid for registered mail, and finally placed the envelope into the hands of the postal clerk. At that moment, he had no idea that he had just set
set in motion one of the most extraordinary legal battles in American corporate history. 4 days later, the envelope arrived at Pepsico's Redemption Center in Somers, New York. A mailroom employee opened it. The first thing he noticed was the $700,000 cashier's check. Then he looked at the order form. Suddenly, his hands
stopped moving. He read it again, then a third time, because under prize requested, it clearly said 1 Harrier jet. At that point, this was no longer a mailroom issue. Within minutes, the entire package was sitting on a supervisor's desk, and within the next 24 hours, 3 senior Pepsico attorneys were gathered around that same envelope inside a conference room. On the table sat a genuine $700,000 cashier's check. Beside it was Pepsi's own official order form, submitted by a customer requesting a military fighter jet as his prize. Pepsico responded immediately. About 10 days later, the entire package was mailed back to John Leonard. Inside was an official letter. It explained that the Harrier jet shown in the commercial was intended purely as entertainment. It had never been a real offer. As a gesture of goodwill, Pepsi also included several free Pepsi coupons. But John Leonard hadn't come for free soda. He had come to enforce the rules. He set the coupons aside and instead walked into a Seattle law firm. Only days later, PepsiCo's general counsel received a formal demand letter. Its message was straightforward. Either PepsiCo should deliver an AV-8B Harrier II fighter jet in accordance with its published promotion, or pay damages equal to the aircraft's fair market value. Now, PepsiCo's legal department had no choice. They began reviewing every condition, every clause, every sentence, every line of fine print, and the deeper they dug, the more an uncomfortable truth began to emerge. John Leonard hadn't broken a single rule. He hadn't committed fraud. He hadn't manipulated the promotion. He had simply done exactly what Pepsi's own official rules allowed him to do. Now, the company had only 2 options. Either deliver a military fighter jet, or before John filed his own lawsuit, PepsiCo would race to federal court first. And ultimately, one of the world's largest corporations chose the second option. PepsiCo had run out of easy options. If the company delivered the jet, it would lose tens of millions of dollars. And if it refused, it would have to explain its own published rules. Eventually, PepsiCo made a decision that completely changed the direction of the case. August 6th, 1996, instead of waiting, PepsiCo went to federal court first. The company filed a declaratory judgment lawsuit against John Leonard. At first glance, it looked like a routine legal filing, but in reality, it was a carefully planned strategic move. Because if John had filed first, the case could have been heard in Seattle, where he lived. Instead, Pepsi beat him to court and pulled the lawsuit to New York. Now, a 21-year-old college student had to travel nearly 3,000 miles to face one of the world's largest corporations in a federal courtroom in Manhattan. At that point, this was no longer just a dispute over a television commercial. It had become a battle over law, logic, and the meaning of written words. The case was assigned to federal judge Kimba M. Wood. Both sides arrived in court fully prepared. PepsiCo argued that the Harrier jet shown in the commercial was never a genuine offer. It was nothing more than creative imagination.
A humorous scene, an advertisement, and no reasonable person could honestly believe that a soft drink company was actually offering a multi-million-dollar military fighter jet as a promotion-y prize. Therefore, there had been no legal offer, and without a legal offer, there could be no contract. But John Leonard's argument was completely different. He said Pepsi had written the rules. Pepsi had published those rules, and following those rules, he had submitted 15 genuine Pepsi points, paid for the remaining points, completed the official order order form and complied with every single requirement. If those rules were never meant to be honored, then the mistake wasn't his, it was Pepsi's. From that moment, the lawsuit became headline news across America. Newspapers, television networks, national media, everywhere. People were talking about the same story. On one side, a multi-billion-dollar corporation. On the other, a college student. And between them, a television commercial that had divided public opinion across the country. Soon after, the case reached the Pentagon. During a press briefing, reporters asked, if Pepsi loses, could an ordinary citizen actually receive a Harrier jet? The answer made the entire room smile. A Pentagon spokesperson replied, the Harrier is not available for sale to civilians, and even if its weapon systems were removed, it wouldn't make a very good lawn ornament. The remark made headlines across the country the very next day. But John Leonard had an answer of his own. Smiling, he said, I don't need the weapons. I just want to park it outside my college. To some people, it was a joke.
To others, it showed confidence, and to many, it became the perfect challenge to corporate America. By then, the lawsuit had escaped the courtroom. Late-night television, comedy shows, newspapers, college campuses, everywhere people were talking about the Pepsi jet case. The pressure on Pepsico continued to grow. And then the company made another move that caught everyone's attention. Quietly, it changed its original commercial, where the screen had once said Harrier jet, 7 million Pepsi points. It now read Harrier jet, 700 million Pepsi points. At that price, buying enough points would cost around $70 million, far more than the value of an actual Harrier jet. But the changes didn't stop there. A new line appeared at the bottom of the screen. Just kidding. 4 simple words. Words that would later become one of the most talked about pieces of evidence in the entire case. John's attorneys immediately preserved a recording of the revised commercial because, from their perspective, the change raised an obvious question. If the original advertisement had always been nothing more than a joke, then why did Pepsi suddenly feel the need to add just kidding? For the next 18 months, both sides continued exchanging documents, legal arguments, and evidence. The irony was impossible to ignore. Pepsico had spent so much money trying to prove that its own commercial was just a joke that its legal fees had already exceeded the cost of producing the advertisement itself. Meanwhile, John Leonard kept repeating the same simple point. I didn't manipulate anything. I simply followed your own rules. Now, the entire country was waiting for one date, August 5th, 1999, the day a federal judge would decide whether that famous television commercial had been nothing more than entertainment or whether, under the law, it had become a real promise.
August 5, 1999, Lower Manhattan, New York City. After nearly 3 years of legal battles, this was the final day. Inside the federal courthouse, Judge Kimba M. Wood took her seat. In front of her lay a detailed 63-page opinion. This wasn't just the end of a lawsuit. It would decide whether a television commercial could ever become a legally enforceable promise. The courtroom was silent. Every eye was fixed on the judge. Moments later, the ruling began. Judge Wood based her decision on 3 separate legal principles. First, she explained that under ordinary circumstances, an advertisement is not a legal offer. It is simply an invitation for customers to make an offer. In other words, something shown in a television commercial does not automatically bind a company to a contract. Then she referred to an earlier case, Lefkowitz v. Great Minneapolis Surplus Store, a landmark decision from 1957. In that case, the court held that an advertisement can become a legal offer only if its terms are so clear, so definite, and so specific that there is no room for further negotiation.
Judge Wood applied that exact standard to Pepsi's commercial. She explained that the television advertisement directed viewers to the Pepsi Stuff catalog, and the catalog contained the official rules. But nowhere in that official catalog was a Harrier jet listed as an available prize. Therefore, her first conclusion was clear. There had never been a legal offer. But that wasn't the most important reason. The second foundation of the ruling was even more significant. American contract law asks a simple question. Would a reasonable person believe it? Not what John Leonard believed, not what Pepsi intended. The only question was, if an ordinary American had watched that commercial back in 1995, would that person honestly believe that a soft drink company was offering a multi-million-dollar military fighter jet as a real promotional prize? Judge Wood's answer was simple. Absolutely not. She examined every scene of the commercial. A high school student piloting a military aircraft, the jet landing in the middle of a school courtyard, the blast blowing away the principal's hat, and moments later, the aircraft taking off again without consequence.
None of that was reality. It was obvious exaggeration, legal puffery. In her opinion, she wrote that the purpose of national advertising campaigns is not to create binding legal contracts, but to capture the public's attention. By then, two major legal issues had already been decided in Pepsi's favor, but one final legal hurdle still remained: the Uniform Commercial Code. Under its rules, any contract for the sale of goods valued at more than $500 must include a written agreement signed by the party against whom the contract is being enforced. John Leonard had almost everything: the cashier's check, the completed order form, the Pepsi points, but he did not have a single document signed by an authorized representative of Pepsico.
And that became the third and final reason the case came to an end. The court ruled in favor of Pepsico. John Leonard's claim was dismissed. 1 year later, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed the same decision. Legally, the case was over, but the real story was only beginning, because when both sides walked out of the courthouse, they had not won in the same way. Pepsi had won the legal battle, but its greatest loss happened outside the courtroom. The world had watched a multi-billion-dollar corporation spend nearly 3 years trying to convince a federal court that its own multi-million-dollar commercial had always been nothing more than a joke. The lawsuit became
A permanent lesson in marketing. Advertising agencies rewrote their internal policies. Corporate lawyers became involved in major advertising campaigns from the very beginning, and soon television commercials started displaying legal disclaimers beneath their biggest promises. Terms and conditions apply for promotional purposes only, not for actual sale. Today, most of us hardly notice those lines, but behind them is the determination of a 21-year-old college student. After the lawsuit, John Leonard quietly moved to Alaska. There, he built a new life, working as a commercial salmon fisherman. Todd Hoffman remained in Seattle. For years, both men rarely spoke publicly about the case. Then, in 2022, Netflix released the documentary Pepsi, Where's My Jet? For the first time in decades, John Leonard and Todd Hoffman sat down in front of the camera and told the entire story in their own words. Pepsico declined to comment. When you look back at the entire story, the most remarkable part isn't that John Leonard lost the lawsuit. The most remarkable part is that he never lied. He never broke a single rule. He never hacked the system. He simply read a catalog carefully, picked up a calculator, and forced one of the world's largest corporations to confront its own words. Maybe that's why even today, before any major company makes a bold promise, the one thing its lawyers insist on is the fine print, because history taught them one unforgettable lesson. Sometimes the most expensive mistake isn't a lie. Sometimes it's simply a sentence that someone else read more carefully than you did.